Well, John, how was your sabbatical?
Well, it's going well. It's winding to a close. I go back teaching in January, but I go back with the good news. So I'm very happy about all of that. Yeah, I'm just trying to get a lot of work done right now, but also try and take a bit of time off in the next little bit. I know you're jetting away to somewhere very warm and sandy.
Yeah.
And lucky you.
Yeah.
I'm not going anywhere this holidays. Last couple of years, and myself and my partner, she and I, we went to Cuba around this time, but this year just staying here.
Wonderful. So, what does tenure mean for you?
It means security, and it means that you're constantly doing what's called PTR, progression through the ranks, right? Primarily, it means security, and it means promotion and more income and things like that. I don't have any sort of burning brands that I've kept hidden that I want to speak now that I have freedom of speech. I might have a few, I think, constructive criticisms of university administration policy and all things like that. But the university has been really supportive of all the work I'm doing. And so I'm pretty much just going to continue doing what I'm doing, knowing that this sounds trite, but knowing that my work is, officially appreciated and that I have sort of a permanent home for my work. As I've said before, I totally recognize and accept that I get a very privileged position compared to what many people have. I have worked very, very hard for that over a very long time, 25 years, a lot of work, a lot of effort. But nevertheless, I do recognize that, it's a privileged position. And so part of what it means is also a tremendous feeling of gratitude. I'm just very grateful for all of the people that helped me and continue to help me along the way.
How does your classroom teaching intersect with your obvious passion to help people in the midst of a meaning crisis?
Well, it directly informs two of my courses. There's a course I teach on higher cognitive processes, which is a course on the psychology of wisdom, and so the issue of the meaning crisis intersects with that very closely. And I'm still teaching Buddhism and cognitive science, the course that gave birth to the whole argument of awakening from the meaning crisis. So that's still there. I will go back to teaching the extracurricular courses on meditation, contemplation, and Tai Chi Chuan, so to give people more practical tools. And in the course on wisdom, I also give my students more practical tools about how to respond. So those are the two courses that are mostly deeply informed by it. The course I teach on the introduction of cognitive science also has sections that are informed with it, because much of what you saw about the nature of cognitive science was taken from that course. And the vision of cognitive science as responding to sort of the ontological whole that we represent in the scientific worldview, that all obviously overlaps with aspects of the meaning crisis. So two courses it impacts on very directly and quite comprehensively, and then in another course it intersects in some major sections. And so it's interesting. I've been on sabbatical, and so I've been on sabbatical for most of the time that the series has been in existence. So a lot of the people that are covering for my courses and stuff like that, they're getting sort of like, they're not angry or annoyed, but they're just like, will you come back and answer all these questions that the students have about the video series? Will you come back? Come on. So I'm happy that, and when I still go to the university to just meet and do my lab work and stuff. And I bump into students now all the time who are going to pursue me in an academic sense because they've seen the video series. So it's had that kind of impact too.
Well, have you noticed anything that now you've been teaching classes, teaching at the university for a while? What have you noticed in terms of changes in just the student population or the zeitgeist that pertains to the meaning crisis and this whole conversation?
So one thing that has really sort of touched my heart about this, and I've mentioned it in several interviews, and the university is recognizing this. They're trying to do something about it, but the mental health crisis is very significant in the university. And like, the university is the predictor of our future, and we're not really paying that much attention to it. The university is that they're holding conferences, like, and they're proposing programs, and they're investing more heavily in things like the mindfulness moments work at U of T through the Multi-Faith Center, and I teach some of my like the meditation courses that way. But you know, when I started teaching, Paul, I'd get one, maybe two students a whole semester coming in with sort of mental health issues, and rarely would I get somebody coming in who wanted to, in other than a philosophical sense, wanted to discuss sort of an existential issue that was troubling them, right? I always had that because, you know, philosophy was a part of the program. But now I'll get several people a week.
Really?
Yeah. Well, you have to remember, I mean, the teaching stream, so I teach 4 courses, sometimes 5. That's a lot.
Yeah,
and some of my courses are quite large, you know, hundreds of students. So that skews me as a representative sample or something like that. But nevertheless, I don't think that's all just that. I think there's clear increase in the strain that I'm sensing amongst the student population. And then above and beyond people that come in requesting accommodation or expressing crisis or sort of breaking down or trying to come back to a broken academic career because of mental health, that's a lot. There's also a more pervasive mixture of hunger, but also despair is not quite the right word, but that sort of creeping towards despair that you can sense. There's a hunger for I want more, and then there's a worry that there isn't more to be found, or they don't know how to find it. And that's often mixed in a sort of semi-conscious way and mixed affectively rather than more cognitively with deep concerns about, you know, looming ecological disaster, breakdown of institutions, political polarization and gridlock. So I see a lot of that now. I'm sorry, I don't know what that noise was.
No, it's okay.
They're doing some renovations in my building, I guess. But anyways, there's that sort of thing I notice all the time. I do notice, and of course, is privilege the right word? I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, my power cord just came down. I to see people close up responding to, you know, the Jordan Peterson phenomena, and I'm not trying to link myself to him in either positively or negatively, but a lot of students coming to my courses after intersecting with Jordan because they wanted to explore the meaning crisis. So there's just been it's, and again, this is selection bias. And so now I'm speaking as a scientist. I mean, I've steered my career that way. So it's to be expected that there should be an increase in response. But I think it's also plausible to say that this increase is not just because my career has steered that way, but it has come to really dominate my work in a lot of ways.
Well, one of the things, you know, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, I think that's a good way to phrase it. I mean, that happened in a sense because of the what metaphor do I want to use? The warm water in the Caribbean and the hurricane, or the spilled gasoline on the floor and the spark.
Yeah.
And obviously Jordan, a big part of the ignition, I'll say, happened, due to some of the culture war stuff that had just hit a
Very
certain
much.
level.
Yeah.
But, my interest in his work had always been much more not of the, I just wish he would leave the political stuff alone, even though that obviously got him a lot of attention. But it's interesting to me how, and this is sort of what we had talked about talking about, how this tracks with the decline of religious institutions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and not I mean, when we say it that way, especially someone who works in the church, the people think, well, you're just looking out for your own institutional self-preservation, which obviously that's a fact of life for me. But Sevilla, when I talked to Sevilla King, one of the comments that she had made was when she was, she got her degree in art, and then she began working as a clinician, and then she had done some work in a clinic, mental health clinic in a community, and at that point began to appreciate the impact that the religious communities or the churches had, especially if you work in a Black community, which I've lived in and worked in most of my life. I mean, the African American population in the United States is, in a per capita way, the most churched community in the United States. I mean, the community's been deeply guided by the institution of church. Yet, in the white communities, where I think we've seen the most rapid decline in church participation, these are the communities in which I think we've seen a lot of the dislocation. And there's obviously some of that in other immigrant communities, the Hispanic community, the practice of going, say, from Latin America to the United States or to Canada. It's a very big move, but I watch people throwing off, for various reasons, their religious practice, their religious communities, their religious commitments, both in terms of the doctrines that they espouse formally, but also often more significantly, the practices that they haven't necessarily appreciated the impacts that these had on their lives. And then down the road, because I think these things impact us very slowly, they find themselves in crisis. And in terms of I started doing YouTube because I thought some of Jordan's work on the Bible is interesting. And then the people coming to me and wanting to talk, and the stories I began to hear from them, and the pattern of the story, which was our family was nominally Christian, and sort of somewhere between the age of 11 and 20, I decided religion was just a made-up thing, sort of along the lines of, Sam Harris became very influential in their life. And then another decade later, found themselves depressed, nihilistic, not quite knowing what to do. And then watching people then at that point start to experiment. They might take up yoga. They might, decide to go back and start visiting churches. They might start reading philosophy, and, just watching this go. And then the practice, in my case, of the most natural thing for me to do in response to this was start meetups, because I work with groups. And so I just put up a meetup.com, said Jordan Peterson meetup, and frankly didn't expect much of anybody to show the second time, because some people said they'd show up the first time, and people did. And, now the meetups are sort of in a crisis, because Jordan, of course, he's gone his own way in this, and he hasn't been seen or done much work. And Jordan's name is a polarizing figure.
Yes.
But what we've discovered in our meetup groups is the refreshing and productive experience of gathering together. And most of the people who come to my meetups don't they don't necessarily have much of a religious commitment. Some of them are, avowed atheists, but the opportunity to come and to talk and to just have a place to talk about, what's on their mind, what they're thinking about, what's going on. And as a pastor, I looked at it and said, this is a lot like pastoral care.
Right. Right.
So, and then of course your contribution, your work has been very helpful. It was, I found it, I think a lot of the people in the meetups found your work more challenging because it was much more technical and philosophical, but I think that's coming along because there's an effort after listening to you for a while that folks sort of began to track. So one of my questions, and I appreciate the conversation you had with Mary and with JP, and you touched on that. There's always sort of a filtering through of philosophical ideas, academic ideas, and usually with time filters into the populace. But I think your experience in university is also important, because one of the senses that I've got surrounding you is that you've always been the kind of a teacher, a kind of professor there who had a heart for the students and cared for them more than just, this is your grade, I'm dispensing information to you, these are the limits of my job. And that comes through in your classes.
Well, first of all, thank you for what you said about my work, and I'm glad that people are finding it useful. I always intended it, I hoped in the right way, it to be more challenging. Because as a good teacher, I'm convinced by Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development. People do their best learning when they can't do it in a completely autodidactic fashion, when you challenge them and they have to go through some significant stretching and alteration in order to learn. And what Vygotsky's argument and research, some empirical research, tends to support that idea, is that when people actually learn the best. And the tricky thing as a good teacher is to get people there. If you push it too high, then they just can't get it and they just give up. And if you just if you keep it below that zone where they can just sort of easily assimilate it, well, they might get a lot of pleasure and sort of sense of conviction out of it. There's not actually a lot of learning. And you've probably seen in some of the conversations I've had with Jordan Hall, I think we need, and some of the arguments I've made, I think we need a very fundamental kind of transformation. And so I think that kind of learning is insufficient. We need a kind of learning that challenges people. And I'm glad to hear, because that was of course a risk on my part, a gamble, because I thought, well, I might put this out and then 7 people will watch the videos because they're hour long and they're complex, difficult argument. But what's happened, and I owe it to you and to Jonathan and other people too, and I'm grateful for that, by the way. What's happened is people have in fact watched the series, and there's meetups and discussion, which is how I want this here, ultimately how I wanted this series to be viewed. I had one of the best experiences in my life, Paul, not that long ago. So I live near a city called Kingston. It's about 2.5 hours away. And there's a movie theater there that's actually showing my series on the movie theater.
Really?
Yeah. And so one of the owners, Wendy, she contacted me, and this is also because one of the patrons had emailed me, and she said she asked my permission. They're not charging anything. They're not making any money.
Right.
This is just a vision she had of what these kinds of repertoire cinemas could be for people, right? But then I went out and I said, well, I'd come out after you watch an episode and do a live Q&A. And Paul, that was one of the most joyous experiences I've had in my life, because that is how I wanted this series actually to be watched, right? I wanted it to be watched by people and provoke them because of the challenges to discussion. And then they would discuss it and they could ask me questions. And I just had a really thrilling time. So that leads me into answering your second question. Yeah, for me, and I want to be clear that I have colleagues and friends that this is true of at U of T, right? I want to be really clear about this. But I know there's also people that are of the ilk that you described. So I'll just put it like that. But many of my colleagues in the psychology department also would espouse what I'm going to say, which is teaching is a vocation for me. I feel called to it. I feel that our culture, except a little bit better at the university than in general, and I think perhaps a little bit better in Canada than in the United States, given some of the stuff I've read. We don't tend to hold education at the level we should hold it, the importance we should hold it, because I mean, the way teachers are responsible for shaping minds. I mean, even uttering that sentence should cause us to pause with reverence, right? We're shaping people's minds. And when you get to university, because it's university, you're not just shaping people's minds, because people are shaping their minds in connection with shaping their identities under this term we call character. They're trying to shape their character. And again, to like that, you have to take that very, very seriously, right? You have to take that very, very seriously. And that's where I can, to whatever meager degree, try to instantiate, my ideal of Socrates, the person where the teaching was always linked to a deep process of trying to, cause insights that afford aspiration and afford transformation of, cognition, consciousness, and character. So a lot of my existential meaning comes from being able to teach in that manner. And because I'm not naturally disposed to being sort of in public display like that, that is perhaps in kind of a reverse way caused me a deeper appreciation for it, because I have to be more consciously aware of the creation of a persona and the risks. I'm speculating now in the somewhat pejorative sense of the word, but I think it makes me more appreciative. It is a very palpable contrast to me. Perhaps that's why I found the thing at Kingston so wonderful. That when I'm when I'm in this forum and I'm doing this and I'm engaging and there's dialogue and I'm getting to do some amazing discussions with people. I want to come back to that at some point, because that goes also to your meetup issue. How I am there, and then when I shift into what you might call a purely social situation, and I become very closely indistinguishable from potted plant furniture. I'm just like, and I know it's sometimes shocking for people. I think I had the sense that when Wendy met me, I went out to Kingston and she's all talking away, and I'm just like, I'm saying maybe a word or two. I'm polite. I'm Canadian. I'm going to be polite. She's Canadian, right? So that's all happening. And I can tell she was sort of like, I'm worried about this. And then I get up and I can slip into the mode. And then she's like, whoa, I could sort of see that. And I of course am aware of that contrast too. So that makes me deeply appreciative of that space that so not only do I feel called in reverence to the task of shaping minds and character in a epistemically and ethically responsible way, I also am deeply appreciative of what it affords me, how it affords me entering into a kind of sociality that I think would be otherwise precluded to me.
I think it's interesting how, I'm by no means an expert on the genesis of the university. Of course, what we sort of look at the university today was an outgrowth in, the late medieval period of the church.
Yep, very much.
Individuals like Martin Luther were, they were churchmen and they taught at the university. There's a lot of that overlap. Again, another interesting aspect of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon was, the thing that caught my attention about Jordan's work was, here's a university professor renting a sizable hall, and people are paying, decent money, and it's filling, and he's talking about the Bible. That's what got my attention, because it's like, well, what's with this? And so then the questions about, very much within the framing of the meaning crisis, how and where can helpful voices be heard, and what types of meetings, practices, rituals? Because one of the things I was very acute of when I started the meetup was, it was very strange, because I intentionally said, okay, I'm not going to open with prayer. I'm not going to engage in all of the rituals I usually do as a pastor. But yet I also knew that avoiding ritual intensifies even the tiny little practices that you're engaging in, and you automatically ritualize them with people.
Yeah, well, Jonathan's right. Jonathan Pajot, right? Ritual is inevitable.
Yes.
Because I think one of the primary functions of ritual, and I've argued this in the series, so you know this, is to act as an important integration between different kinds of knowing, and bringing different kinds of normativity. I mean, people, so you got propositional knowing, and it gives us rules, and people say, I don't want rules. But then what they do is they default to the routines that are given to them by procedural knowing, and then they try to break the routines and their habits, and then they default to whatever realizations the perspectival knowing is giving them, and then they no, and then they drop down to, right, they default to the roles that they just find themselves naturally assuming, right? So I think trying to escape the normativity I think what they're trying to do is address a real issue. They're trying to address the tyranny of propositional knowing, but they're doing it in the wrong way. They've misunderstood that as trying to escape from normativity, when all they're doing is then just shifting to the normativity found within procedural knowing or perspectival knowing or participatory knowing. So that's why I've tried to argue for the alternative is no, let's get clear about all these of their normativity and what are the processes by which they're integrated together so we can get that kind of connectedness that we're actually seeking. So I think part of what made Jordan so huge was he was commenting on Jordan is like commenting on a sunrise. So like, what part do you talk about, and what are you missing, and
right,
and what is it also blinding you to? Like, I'm trying to get it on all kinds of meanings of that, right? But part of what I think was going on, right? And let me be clear, I agree with you. I largely reject almost all of Jordan's sort of political thing. And for some of the reasons that you and I have talked about, right? And part of it, I think, goes towards that tyranny of the propositional and things like that. Putting all that aside, I do want to say, though, that the two issues were kind of folded together in a certain way. I think Jordan put his finger on the meaning crisis. And what he did, I think, I don't know if unwittingly is the right adjective, right adverb, but something like that. I don't think he has an explicit theoretical framework. At least I have not seen it, right? But what he did was he was giving people basically a much more participatory and perspectival way of interacting with the Bible, right? And that's what and you've pointed this out repeatedly, and you've used it. And I mean this in a constructive sense, is criticism of me, right? Is what Jordan offers that I don't is mythos. And I accept that criticism. I think that's legit. And I think that's what, and I've tried to argue that explicitly in my series. I think that's what mythos does. And Jordan was doing that. I think what concerned me is that, and like you, I'll say this again, I separate those two poles in him apart. But it's not so clear that those poles were separated in his audience. And I found that's one of my sort of the places from which I most deeply sort of want to critically engage with Jordan. I'm going to be filming a 2-hour thing with Anderson Todd. He's one of my former students. He teaches courses on Jung at the University of Toronto. He's a practicing psychotherapist himself, and it's going to be a 2-hour thing on Jung, because of course part of, and you've acknowledged this, and Jordan does too, there's no secret here, part of the secret, if that's the right word, part of the secret of Jordan's success was exactly Jung. And
Yes.
Part of what Jung was trying to do was, and this is, I want to go really carefully here, and maybe you can help me out, but because this sounds like it's degrading, but it's not. He was able to, I mean, what Jung does is he sort of psychologizes the mythos, right? He puts it into a way in which people can have a perspectival and participatory knowing. See, what Jung does is he says, those symbols out there are actually states and places and images that you can spontaneously call forth in here. And so instead of them being things that are out there that merely refer, they are also in you, and you can participate and be involved with them. And so that's what I mean about how Jung acts like this powerful way of translating via the mythos, right, the propositions of the Bible, if you'll allow me that way of talking about it, into the perspectival and the participatory. And then Jordan, you know, for whatever criticism you have to have of Jordan, because, and he should be, because he is a public academic, right? He's a charismatic guy. And what I think one of the reasons, this is a bit of a theory of charisma that I'm working on. I think one of the reasons we find people charismatic is when they can do exactly that for us. When they can help us to translate between representing things to instantiating them within us, so that we come to not just be convinced by them, but we identify with them, so that our more fundamental machinery of motivation gets engaged. And that's what I think he does. And so I think the charisma really, his charisma really jived with the Jungian program and helps to explain why it was such a deep success. Now, I have criticisms of it because, like I said, one of the ways, just one, and I'm going to be exploring this with Anderson, in which I'm concerned about how the propositional political stuff is still confused with the Jungian charismatic stuff, if you'll allow me those categories, is that Jordan often at times, not always, but often. So everybody hear me. I said often, not always, right? I don't want 17,000 comments. But he said this here. Jordan says a lot of things in a lot of places. But often, right, he presents it as if there is the interpretation, right, of this symbol or this story. And that's very problematic. It's especially problematic from a Jungian framework in which Jung is very clear on not confusing any particular cultural image or proposition or statement with the archetypes. The archetypes always transcend, and they're always open-ended. This is why I claim that Jung is ultimately a non-theist, right? They're open-ended, and the true sense that you're in contact with a archetype symbolically is that it keeps churning up, challenging, back to that notion, challenging new images and ideas that disturb you, because the whole point is compensatory. It's supposed to shift you out of any comfortable framework that you're in. And so that's a criticism I have. So while I have praised what I think Jordan was doing, the charismatic invocation, and I think that's the right verb, by the way, the charismatic invocation of the mythos, I do think the fact that he did not take care, and I don't think he was disposed to distinguish the political from the mythological, it shows up in that kind of, you know, this is the interpretation of the symbol. And that's worrying, because that gives him, I think, an inappropriate authority with respect to the text.
Well, and that, in some of the ways that, I mean, for example, one of the areas that his particular interpretation. So where he sort of crossed paths with me, obviously, with, you know, training and practice in terms of biblical interpretation, his interpretation of, you know, the meek inheriting the earth and the Beatitudes. You know, what for me, when I saw that, it was, you know, it was technically wrong. And but so then, of course, I had to deal with all of the Peterson fans and so on and so forth. But what occurs to me is when it comes to the establishment of religion, it's the relationship, and lately I've been phrasing it, I'm sure you've heard it, that in some ways the political is now and the religious is always.
I like that, by the way. I think that's helpful. I
Yeah.
think that's very helpful.
And especially in some, when you're looking at the development of Christianity in the Roman Empire, there's so much, and then Augustine, with the strange Neoplatonism and Augustine's City of God, where he's trying to manage the political and that massive work of his. This is all tremendously challenging. And then of course you get to another enormously important flashpoint, which is the Protestant Reformation, where again, people talked about the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and at about that time I was talking to Ron Dart, who's in Western Canada, and talking about Erasmus versus Luther.
Right, that's an important confrontation.
And I would say what's happening now is in many ways chump change compared to the volcanic explosion that was the Protestant Reformation, and obviously because of, and I don't mean I'm doing like you now, I'm making apologies before I'm about to say something that might get me in trouble. The rather totalitarian and tyrannical practices that the Roman Catholic Church had used to try to perpetuate their institutional authority obviously gets broken open by the conflict within the German, the Holy Roman Empire, and whereas Luther in many ways sort of did similar to what Jan Hus had done a generation before, because of the various different political changes that had been around in Italy and Germany, you have this tremendous explosion. And that explosion would happen again in England and continue to reverberate in many ways through sweeping back and forth.
Oh, sure.
I pray we're not, whereas it is true that we're living in interesting times. I pray that we are not in for the kind of dislocation, chaos, and violence that Europe endured.
Well, yeah, I mean, you see the religious wars in Europe. You see the English Civil War. England is like fractured and almost destroyed. Very, very much so. I agree with that. This sounds so hubristic. One of my hopes, and I think people have resonated with this in my work, is to try and create something analogous to what I do in cognitive science, which is a bridging language, a language that is not, and it's not a trivial, tolerant respect kind of language, but no, I want a bridging language so that we enter into deep discussion and dialogue with each other, because I don't think that polite discussion and sort of just, Star Trek acknowledgement of our many differences and we're all, that sort of thing, I don't think that's enough to forestall that kind of bloodshed. I only think deep transformative dialogue and discussion is, which doesn't mean, and we've got to give up, don't jump on me for this, Paul. We have to give up a teleological, a Phileia vision of dialogue, that unless it ends in sort of a comprehensive agreement, it was all for nothing, which is no. And well, then all we're trying to do is get respect for each other. No, we're not. I mean, I've learned a lot from you. I think it's fair to say that what I do and how I work has been transformed in the interaction I've had with you and Jonathan and Jordan and Guy. And you and Jonathan have both said that's the same for you. We haven't come to some sort of grand metaphysical agreement, but we're in deep dialogue, and it's transformative. And I think that is the only thing that is, well, I hope that it's plausible to say that that is the kind of thing that would forestall the temptation towards sort of political violence as a way of trying to resolve these issues. So I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm working so hard on the next series and on this whole topic of dialectic and dialogue, because that's exactly the concern I see. And I want to, and this is again something that I'm trying to do differently. I mean, I'm going to keep doing the monologues because I'm a teacher, but I'm trying more and more to do the multiple person dialogue, right? And more making people see, no, it's actually this collective, intelligence working in distributed cognition that is really, really generative. And so both in content and in manner, I'm trying to exemplify a response to a potential threat that I recognize along with you. I know the history too, and
we don't want to repeat it.
We don't want to repeat it, and the irony is, of course, both in Europe in the it's 1648, and then of course later in England when I forget which monarch it is, but secularism was explicitly created as a way of trying to put an end to the religiously motivated bloodshed. And I didn't go into that right because the series wasn't so much about the cause of secularism, but what the rise of the meaning crisis. But right, that needs to be acknowledged, and so we have to be very careful about how we tread on secularism and how we want to respond to it.
I agree. And I am, as I said, a couple of meetups into we've been doing meetups now for 2 years. And one of the things that I had said to the people who were there is I had always wanted the church to be a place where we could have these conversations. And
I've admired that about you so much. Honestly, Paul, if I had seen that growing up, you know what really angered me was when there would be the pretense of dialogue, but it was just another monologue. That really angered me. I would be, well, let's have a discussion about this. No, it wasn't a discussion, right? If there's no, right, it was just a pretended monologue. And that's what I've always said about people. That's why I trust you. I see good faith commitment to genuine dialogue. And the fact that you see that as like a calling for the church, it's like, I deeply respect that. I admire it. I think that is really good work. I do, Paul.
Well, thank you. And then, just, I didn't know anything about Urban Abbey. And then we get
so much fun.
And then we get this invitation. And then of course I had a chance to talk to Scotland about the story of this. And
I saw that video.
And just so heartened by this and these developments. And I'm talking to a friend in Southern California whose church is doing a big building project. And, and John, my friend in Southern California, is trying to give them the vision for this kind of space as a part of the church. And now it's difficult because it reflects the kind of, now we have this clinical therapeutic language of differentiation. It reflects the kind of differentiation where I can on one hand be a committed Christian and hold to these things, but at the same time give space in a non-anxious way, in an enduring way that, says to my friend Joey, for example, at the meetup, whether or not you ever, in the words of evangelical language, cross the line, we will continue to dialogue and we will cherish this conversation together, and then to find space without it being, as you said, sort of that this is the work of God, and at least within a Christian framework.
Sure.
And I know, I mean, one of the things that I think also, church history also informs us of is that these tensions have been with the church all the way in the beginning.
Oh, sure.
And you find them in the New Testament. And I really do hope that we can somehow create rituals and practices by which we can do this, continue to do this, because the dirty little secret in the church for a very long time has been churches like to present uniform facades in terms of their doctrinal positions and such. I don't know if it's the advent of the printing press or information technology or the internet, but the diversity of beliefs in a real congregation is so simply alarming that to not be honest about it seems to just be lying. And I think, as in, you know, the little that you reflected about your story, this has done tremendous damage to the church. I
think so. And I think it was bound up again, and this goes back to one of my critiques, right, with the tyranny of the propositional. I think there's that the diversity I see even within, for lack of a better adjective, the secular groups is the same thing. So when you go to a circling practice, people come in, and it's very much an ecclesia, Paul. It really is. It takes on. Well, you talk to Guy, you have some sense of it. You've perhaps seen some of the dialogues. But again, people, even in those secular, they're not coming with, you know, a shared monolithic. They come in, and you know where the diversity especially is? They come in, right, with the diversity is really often in their propositional commitments. There's a little bit more, what do you want to call it? Communal identity in terms of sort of practices that they do, right? What I'm saying is, people don't intersect like this. They intersect in, like, it's Wittgenstein's things. Like, there's no one line that runs from the beginning of the rope to the end. There's various layers. There's all these layers, and they intersect and they overlap in all of these ways. And what I'm particularly interested in is how that has, in these new emergent practices, both within, as you're saying, religious communities, and without, like what Guy is doing with circling, right, is the foregrounding of that fact. The foregrounding that we're not going to get, you know, what Durkheim used to call mechanical solidarity. We should stop looking for that. We should look for, you know, doesn't Paul talk about that, the different parts of the body, right? And they do have different functions. So, I mean, again, it's an ancient image, but, you know, Durkheim brought up the idea of, no. What we really want is, we don't want mechanical solidarity. We want a division of labor. And what we have to do is just figure out, like I was saying before, you know, a higher order commitment to the process. And so that's what really binds people. They come in and they say that, okay, we're not going to we don't have one identity, or we don't have like one ideology. We have this, we overlap and touch in many ways, and it's dynamic and shifting and very creative and generative. And what we'll share is, we'll all share a commitment to this process and making it as self-correcting, as self-transcending as we possibly can. And that's what's really interesting me about a lot of this, because as the part of what I said, what I'm doing is because of Jordan Hall's idea about trying to get what's sort of the meta psychotechnology. And I think that ancient dialectic in the Neoplatonic sense was doing this in the ancient world. And so trying to understand that and what that was like, and then put it into dialogue, pun intended, with these modern practices, you know, analogous to what I did in Awakening, and trying to get a deeper understanding so that I can bring in some cognitive science. Like, what is going on here? Because things are definitely shifting. There's all this move happening. And it's, Paul, you know, if I didn't see you and Jonathan and Mary doing this, but especially you, because you're a pastor, so you get to actually do it, if you'll allow me this institutionally, right, that verb. I don't want to make you sound like an institution, because you're a loving person. But the point I'm trying to make is, if I didn't see that, I wouldn't be so, I hope, this means a lot to me when I say I don't claim to have a foreclosure argument on Christianity. If I didn't, like, I would be much, I probably wouldn't say that if I didn't see these things happening. So I don't know how much that means to you, but from my side, it means a lot. It does. It's like, I see this, and to me, that says, okay, well, are some Christians that clearly have their finger on the pulse of change here, and a change that I think is central, and that I'm diving in very deeply, and I think is analogous. We're recovering in this change something analogous. We're recovering and also making something new. But the recovery part is recovering something deeply analogous to what we used to have in the ancient world.
Well, and I, it's stuff is, you see, so all of these disciplines that we have in the university now, and in some ways they're fairly siloed. And one of the things that I've really seen from you is how cognitive science is at least trying to break down some of these silos.
Yeah,
so
very much.
So some of these disciplines can speak with one another. And of course, if you read, George Marsden, who's a scholar in my tradition. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a historian.
No,
He wrote a book about a decade ago about the the history of the university in the West, because of course, Harvard, Yale, these were all founded by religious communities.
yes.
And so a lot of this history is very recent in historical terms. We have all of this knowledge amongst all of these different disciplines, and in some ways all birthed by this, these religious structures, and
Yes.
and then via Darwin, and of course Darwin means, and I think, one of the things I really appreciated about your treatment of Darwin was how it really helped me see that Darwin isn't, that Darwin moment, whatever it meant in terms of biology, it was really a far broader movement. So all of this comes down, and now we've sort of got all of these siloed disciplines, but we need them all together. Mm-hmm. And so these big questions that philosophy, of course, and theology have been wrestling with for thousands of years, in both in the church and in many other disciplines, all of those big questions were sort of thrown to the side. Yes. We don't need to worry about these things. That's all theoretical.
Well, it's not only that. There was an Enlightenment psychology, which has largely turned out to be, I think, tremendously disconfirmed, if not falsified, about the nature of human meaning making and happiness, and the kinds of things that Steven Pinker still sort of argues. It's right. Again, not that the Enlightenment was wrong. It was wrong in thinking that it was complete, such that the big questions could be sort of eventually pushed aside. Initially, what happened is, the Enlightenment philosophers tried to answer the big questions, but then they fell prey. And I've sort of argued this, and this is why I say, philosophy and theology are important. But my use of theology only applies to sort of post 12th century theology. But the reason why I'm interested in the topic of religion, and some people are saying, why can't you just leave religion out of it? It's because these questions cannot be answered just propositionally or theologically. If philosophy was philia sophia, like it was in the ancient world, and theology, and I'm criticizing both, so don't jump on me, right? If theology was back to what it had to be, which is you had to undergo deep personal transformation in order to come to know God. You couldn't just be doing discourse and the manipulation of proposition. This is what I mean about why we need something like religion, because those big questions can't be answered and I'm now using these words in just a modern sense, in a purely theological or philosophical way. Right. And so that was, to me, one of the big mistakes of the Enlightenment, thinking that we could emulate science in its production of propositional theory, and that would be sufficient for answering these questions that, of course, have to do with, as you're saying, a much more synoptic integration across and beyond the sciences. where you and I differ is I think that still leaves us within naturalism. You think it takes us beyond. But I think where we do agree is that the idea that these questions, what I'm saying is I think these questions were put aside because of a very mistaken theory of psychological theory that we were given by the Enlightenment, that which I've done in more detail in the series. And so I think that I like the point you're making here. Getting not only dialogue going as a practice, but making it do, and this is what ancient dialectic did as well, do this synoptic integration across the disciplines. Yes, that is also very much part of, I don't want to use this word, but the vision I have for what dialectic was and what we could be moving towards. Sorry, that was a long rambling answer, but I was trying to draw a lot of things together in it.
No, that was very helpful for me because, and whereas I agree with you that this sort of Enlightenment dismissiveness, that was perhaps, at least for a time, a necessary thing in a way to address ecclesiastical totalitarianism.
And also the rain shadow of as we mentioned, of the religious wars that had drenched Europe and England in blood, right? So it's like, let's leave all that. Ritual is a private matter, right? That was the idea. You'll do all those spooky things behind doors on your own or in your own little community. And what we'll do is we'll have social contracts. We'll have social contracts and set propositions that we all agree on. And and there is merit to that. There is merit to that. We should equally not be dismissive of that. But I think I'm sorry, I interrupted, but I think what I'm saying is I think there is a comprehensively among groups that in other ways academically disagree with each other, there is a comprehensive sort of convergence of realization that the Enlightenment view is in some deep ways inadequate for us.
And we have discovered that, postmodernity, I think, was helpful with this. We discovered that, well, even though we thought we just sort of moved this all away, you can't really move this all away. Those things endure. Those things have ramifications, repercussions, and consequences. And so as we look at sort of a post-secularism, then suddenly there's a realization that, okay, well, in a sense, if theology was the queen of the disciplines and we sort of put the queen away like England put the queen away, maybe we got to bring the queen out again and talk to her some more, because we realize that, and I think the meaning crisis, potentially, at least one way of thinking about this, the meaning crisis is perhaps at least an indication that we can't just bifurcate ourselves and we've discovered all these tools to make the world a better place, and we have made the world a better place. I mean,
that is beyond question. But the issue is, why didn't that bring about a utopia?
Right.
So why does Pinker? I mean, the biggest irony of Pinker's book is, why did he have to write it?
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, and then you get back to Dostoevsky, who makes and Tolstoy, who make the point that, okay, and I see this all the time pastorally. I mean, so I work in we have all of these circumlocutions to talk about poverty and inequality. So I live and work in a neighborhood which is, whatever term you want to say, the folks are poorer. But I know plenty of people who live in neighborhoods where the folks are richer and there's more order and the streets are clean and the houses are maintained and everything is lovely and people have plenty of resources and they have good medical care and they have all of these things. And what's wrong? Why is there depression? Why do these, and here's the irony of the meaning crisis, that its pathologies often are the wealthy and affluent are more beset by its pathologies than the poor.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's something very analogous. I mean, this is often misattributed to Maslow. He doesn't really have the hierarchy of needs. It's an oversimplification. And he sort of acknowledges that this model was much more like Aristotle's model. But all of that qualification said, I think there's something like the hierarchy that I think we always need meaning because but the meaning, and I've made arguments about that in terms of relevance realization and things like that. But the kind of, when you're in poverty or you're in distress, right? The sort of I'm running out of words. The existential sort of way of understanding the meaning project that can't come to the foreground. And then somewhere in the Bible it says, "Don't preach the gospel to somebody if they need a coat," or something along those lines, right? Right, right. Because that's the salience network is really designed to function in a lot of important ways, and so I think that the great truth of the Enlightenment project was many people were in such scarcity. What's really telling for me, though, is also a reverse argument than the one you just made, Paul, is even when you look back in times when many more people were more beset by more exigent economic circumstances, those issues were not absent either. Issues of despair, of self-deceptive, living in the sense of living in a decadent. Look at the Cathar revolution in France, right? In the 13th, here's this huge Gnostic revolution. What's going on there, right? Yes, people, the economic situations are much worse, but somehow the sense of being existentially entrapped overwhelms southern France, so much so that the church has to launch a crusade to put it down and create the Holy Inquisition and the first sort of totalitarian ideology and secret police, kind of thing. It's like, whoa. So I think if you put both of those arguments together, it tells you, you get this very complex thing. You're right. Affluenza really brings out the meaning crisis, but but nevertheless, even in much more impoverished conditions, people can nevertheless, these things can override the things, the more, the things that are lower on Maslow's hierarchy, and come to the fore in powerful ways. So I think we have to give up, this is what I've argued, we have to give up simplistic pictures, models about how we can, this is why I'm so suspicious of utopias. I know Alexander Bard he'll get angry when I say this, but we're so suspicious of utopia because simplistic models of how to get human happiness and fulfillment, I think they do not comport well with how really varied that history is. As I just tried to quickly relate it. Because like you said, at times, it's only when we've got affluenza, that we see the meaning crisis. But that's not always true either. You get like the Cathar revolution, in which people are not doing that well, and a huge revolt occurs.
Well, and I think that, in many ways, you see similar dynamics also in the Protestant Reformation.
Yes,
where,
yes.
Luther's psychology. So you've got a very firm grip on society by the Roman Catholic Church by that point. And Luther makes this move to psychologizing, in a way, faith. Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
And there's certainly a huge amount of freedom that comes out in that. But many of that, and again, a reading of church history finds that Protestants have for a long time, done terrific damage to church history because they've told it in a very a very convenient way to illuminate their heroes.
Yes.
But we see this again and again, and what I'm hopeful for is through, and again, and I quite frankly thank Jordan Peterson for this, because and I, you know, after listening to you and figuring out what you were doing, I began to see how, you know, your framing of the meaning crisis helped me understand what was happening in that Peterson moment. But he sort of broke open, you know, say, you know, via something like YouTube, which what was YouTube? How could that be used? But sort of broke open a way for people to find one another and to use some of these tools to 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 I think what we have to do in many ways is feel our way forward to see how some of these old barriers that are not terribly helpful right now, we can transcend them to find ways of addressing this. And I'm so glad you told me that story of the theater showing your because for me the opportunity of that is obviously, well, anybody can watch it on YouTube, but the opportunity for that is communal. We can watch it together. We can talk about it.
Yeah, and I get. I mean, there's a couple of online versions of that. Future Thinkers doing is one, and then there's another group that they're doing online sort of watch parties around my work, and I get emails from groups all around the world where they're meeting up to discuss. Sorry, this sounds self-promotional.
No. What? If you don't talk about it, we're not going to know about it. So you got to afford yourself some self-promotion.
Well, the point is that is optimally what I would like. You see, I agree with you that Jordan was very provocative, but we need to move beyond the stage of provocation. I want to try and facilitate dialogue and dialectic. I want to try and do what what I feel called to do, which is, again, try to create vocabulary, try to create grammar, try to create, help to reverse engineer the psychotechnologies for these dialogues. That's something I want to try and do. I want to try and, we have historical templates. We've been invoking history a lot together here today. We have historical templates. And like I say, we have one from the ancient world in which dialogical practices. There was a psychotechnology of dialogical practices operating within distributed cognition. And you can see it gets taken up into the church, right? Aquinas, even as late as Aquinas, he's presenting his material as a dialogue within a dialectical format. That's not a coincidence. That's not a nicety on his part. That's because that is the fundamental grammar for how he sees the marshaling, right, and the enhancement of distributed cognition, using my language. He would say the church and other things, right? And I don't want to be dismissive of the angelic doctor. But the point I'm trying to make is I agree. We shouldn't try and a priori, create an idolatrous ideology of how this should unfold. But on the other hand, right, I do want to get beyond just provoking people to this, right? I want to try and afford and facilitate and enhance by bringing the best understanding, both, cognitive scientific and also participant observation in these emerging practices and communities. You see, I'm doing a lot of this. I'm meeting with people. I'm talking. I'm trying to understand it because I want to. I want to be an understanding person, but I also want. I want to move beyond. Beyond provocation to provision. That's what I want to do.
I've been thinking actually a lot about this question of provocation lately, because I, like you, I mean, I didn't just on YouTube, I might have just popped out of the ground, making commentaries about Jordan Peterson's biblical series. But before that, a deep concern that I was expressing in my own denomination in the Christian Reformed Church was that I felt that in many ways, the machinery to do this work has been broken.
Yeah.
In that, and I think we see this in our because obviously we have, in the United States, we have the Congress, we have the House and the Senate. In the Christian Reformed Church, we have a synod, we have classes. These are supposed to be deliberative bodies. These are supposed to be spaces where a confessionalism is supposed to be, so here's a limited safe harbor of what we agree on, and then out here we can have we can have dialogue and conversations, and in this way we can continue to grow and develop. But what happened is that through a lot of anxiety and fear, we're going to lock everything down, and then implicit confessions grew into the church, and so the stuff that we were supposed to work on over here sort of got put on the shelf, and now you have all these other things you're going to get in trouble for. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately has been the question of provocation. And whereas in many ways, I think in our cultural moment, we rightly have and perhaps pastors and university professors share a certain hesitance towards this, we do know that even in a clinical setting, and I also know that in a pastoral setting, in a church setting, there needs to be a level of provocation.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And we see, obviously, Jesus, let's say on the church side of this, contrary to what a lot of people who have never read the New Testament imagine, Jesus could be enormously provocative, and in fact, so much so that even warring parties in their own culture war, who could agree on absolutely nothing, could come to agreement that they wanted him dead. The same thing happened to Socrates. So,
Very much. No. I don't want to be misunderstood. I think, and I mean, I even argued for replacing the Buddhist Four Noble Truths with the four enabling.
That was
provocation,
something.
Right? And I clearly think and present Socrates as a highly provocative figure, and I completely acknowledge Jesus as a deeply provocative figure, because insights ultimately are provoked or invoked. They're not presented or just made. I totally agree with that. And I think this, if you'll allow me some cog sci language, the system has to go into criticality if it's going to restructure. But the thing is, you don't just provoke criticality. You also have to you have to create a virtual engine. You have to create a well-understood set of constraints that limit the criticality so it restructures rather than breaking down back into that religious, chaos and war that none of us want to return to. We don't want to go back to those dark days.
No, I agree. And so then I think the challenge is, figuring out how to have both of those. I really love, your lectures on the opposing, that is really helpful.
No, very much. And the idea of opponent processing or replacing adversarial processing is a model we should be shifting to. That's a big deal. And I owe that to, on one hand, Plato, and to my good friend, Leo Ferraro, who's a partner with me in a lot of the cog-sci work I do. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think if I'm right, so big if there, if I'm right, and if I do it well, what I want to try and present is that's what the ancient Socratic product, and then how it gets taken up into the Platonic and then the Neoplatonic tradition. That's what ancient dialectic was. It was that way of trying to create, a space of conditions within which insight can be provoked, but it will reliably self-organize in a way. And so, and you see similar things also in other traditions, but what's interesting, like Slingerland's book on trying not to try, how you can see the Taoist and Buddhist projects about trying to get to the state where you're trying not to try, where you're trying to set up all the conditions so that you can provoke a self-organization that you can't directly do. So if you'll allow me an overused metaphor, I'm trying to find the sweet spot between provocation and provision, because I think that's what actually was found in dialectic and the way it engages distributed cognition and affords. Because when you're when I'm getting into these discussions, for example, with Guy and with Chris and with Jordan Hall, that's why I call it dialogos. By what you get the sense of the logos, right? There's this emergent self-organizing system that's like a third factor, and it takes over. It doesn't take over in any tyrannical sense, but you're led, everybody's led, and it happens in circling too. You're led to places that you can't get to on your own. But when you look, and this goes back to something we said earlier, there's a lot of implicit and some explicit ritual in which people are trying to set, what's the best set of constraints to put around this so that it doesn't spin off in all kinds of crazy and potentially harmful ways. So that's what I'm trying to get a hold of.
Well, it's interesting when you were describing that, that third thing that enters the room. I think
Yes.
in Christian terminology, that's in a sense the role of the Holy Spirit. And
sure.
if you look at Christian practice, you'd have, people come together for prayer, they come together for debate. I mean, all of this stuff, and it's this.
And even the reading in the past, like the way as I mentioned, the series, and I've come back now to even see Lectio Divina even more deeply, because the reading in the past was done communally and in its resonant manner. So I think there was an element of that going on too. If you'll allow me to bend things from both ends, but I think when people were reading in the past in the monasteries, they were circling as well as reciting, and I think that's something very, very powerful. Yeah, I think, people have invoked this, and I hope it's not disrespectful. Where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am also. I talked about this with JP, brought this up, and I say, well, I see people when they're in these practices, and I've mentioned this to Guy several times, and he's really excited about talking about it more. I see them spontaneously, these highly secularized, often post-religious people, falling naturally into religious language, spiritual metaphors, iconic kind of imagery, archetypal imagery, to try and talk about what's happening here.
Well, and this word religious, I'm just trying to figure out how I can talk. I mean, because one of the things that I bump into is once this word comes up, and usually it's more from the Enlightenment camp. It's
yes,
that people will say, well, I'm not religious, and I think maybe we have different understandings of what that word means, because when I watch you live and I watch you act, and when I watch you, the way you make decisions and react and interact with your community, it sure looks familiar to me. And
yeah, I think that's right. Sorry, keep going.
No, and so just even this morning on Twitter, because this stuff comes up, and Twitter is a very dangerous platform.
I was about to say exactly that adjective. It's very dangerous. It just provokes.
And so then obviously everything's just curtailed into these tiny little sound bites, and so I was talking to Adam, who has a YouTube channel. I said, religion is some ways sort of like worldview plus, worldviews plus action, and passions have to come into play there somehow. And one of the things that I've talked about this before, and I've obviously talked about it in my videos. I mean, so much of what normal people have to live with. I've so loved your four P's. I have used that so often, and will continue to use it. And I always warn people that pastors are thieves. If we hear something that we find useful, we just rip people off. No footnotes in sermons. But people are so embedded in larger stories, and yeah, and I don't know. I mean, figuring out how we can talk with one another, both respect the institutions and communities we come with, and at the same time make progress forward, and even when we don't know exactly what that will look like. That seems to be, it seems to be the path that we must take.
Yeah, I agree. So this brings back, I mean, I tried, and that's the right verb. I tried to help that by, I tried to bring up this term religio, because I was trying to bring up, right, because I think religio is unavoidable. It's inevitable. That
Yes.
we have to pursue this deep sense of connectedness for all of the arguments surrounding relevance realization. And we have to pursue it in a way in which we're gaining as much access as we can to all the different kinds of knowing. And that commits us to mythos and symbolism. And if the viewers of my series know, I use that term in a very deep sense, in a way that is very consonant, I believe, with how Jonathan Pajot uses it. So I see all of that as inexorably bound up with our cognitive agency. And I've tried to argue that very carefully. And that's why I use the word religio. I use that word, though, because I'm trying to acknowledge that this fact that we both agree on, that many people have a self-identification that is to belong to the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S. And I take it that this is not a massive wave of insincerity or even a kind of massive wave of self-deception. They're trying to put their finger on something, and I see you trying to do that too. You're trying to understand, what is it? Because you'll often use the term, and they use it, and you question it the way I do too. Well, I'm spiritual, which means how I operationalize that is, well, I realize that I need to do religio, and I have to use symbolism and mythos and a bunch of practices that are transformative and blah, blah, and all that stuff I've argued. They're saying, I acknowledge all of that, but, and then what comes after the but is what, sorry, that's an odd sentence. What comes after the but, right, is the thing we're trying to get clear of. And I'm in that boat, right? So I often try to be very specific. I will say, well, I am not a Christian, or I'm not a Buddhist, or I'm not this, right? So I think part of what they mean is that. So I think for very many people, it means I'm not what, I don't belong to the religion that I was potentially introduced to as a child, right? I think that's part of what comes after the but. But then there's this more comprehensive thing, when we both mentioned it. There's this understanding of something like secularism that has something to do with the science, and something with the state being committed to a space that is supposed to keep us free from the religious wars. And there's something about those commitments. Well, I'm trying here with you, Paul. Part of what I hear coming is, well, right, I don't belong to the religion of my childhood for various reasons. Some of them intellectual, some of them cultural, some of them, right, completely idiosyncratic and developmental.
Or moral, because my religion had these moralities and I can't have those.
Totally, and they mix up in all kinds of ways. So there's that. There's a commitment to science. They want to say, well, I'm committed to science because first of all, they might be committed to it epistemically. I think it tells us a lot of things. It gives us a lot of knowledge. They might be committed to it because of all the technology. And Heidegger is right. We believe in science. A lot of why we believe in science is because of the pervasiveness of the power of technology. Yep. Right. So there's that. And let's not forget that technology is keeping me alive in Canada right now. If I don't have that technology, I'm dead. Right. I'm just dead. Right. So there's all of that. And then there's this last thing. There's a commitment. And I think many people, they carry the guts of the commitment without understanding why it's so important. And they use phrases that don't quite capture it. They say like separation of church and state. But what I think we're still with is, we need a space that protects us from returning back to the religious wars that drenched. But again, one more caveat, sorry, I'm being too much of a philosopher here, right? But one more caveat is, we came to realize that there's something right about that, but trying to understand that space is completely separable from religio. We drenched the 20th century in the blood of that mistake. Thinking that that space that's supposed to protect us from the religious wars is also a space that is pure from religio, led us into the titanic bloodshed of the 20th century. So I'm like you, I'm trying to understand I'm committed to religio, but, and then there's this set of other commitments. And I think, by the way, just to make one more point, and then I'll let you get back because I'm talking too much. But I think talking about it in terms of the commitments people are making rather than the propositions they think are true or false is a better way of understanding it. And that's what I'm trying to do as a quick analysis here. I'm committed to, mythos and symbolism for activating, right, my religio. I'm committed, right? I'm not committed to the religion of my parents. I'm committed to science, and I'm committed to the secular space, sometimes with the more nuanced understanding that that's a lot trickier than in the Enlightenment made it out to be. So that's why I wanted to say to that very difficult question, because we wanted to sort of get into this question about what is religion, in some sense.
No, that was excellent. That was really helpful, because as a pastor, one of the things that you very quickly realize in the when you meet often, not always, when you meet someone from the African American community and they learn I'm a pastor, well, then they won't call me Paul, they'll call me Reverend or Pastor, because that's the formation. The Hispanic community, similar. The white community, they hear I'm a pastor, then suddenly you begin to watch those wheels turn, because it's not just the commitment to the secular, which often for many people gets political very quickly. And that's part of the real catastrophe of, I don't know, because when you chart the entire, since the Second World War, the United States has been, so the United States recruited God to fight godless communism during the Cold War. And then, of course, you have 9/11. And so religious fundamentalists are, those who are problematic. And so America has sort of been flipping on this in terms of where we stand. Prior to this, if the American president would have to say, God bless you, at the end of his speech, otherwise there would be uproar. Today, depending on who the next one will be, God now has become a political fight in the United States in a difficult way. And so I really like how you phrased it. Commitments people are making more than the propositions they are holding or rejecting. But then in the secular realm, especially with respect to the meaning crisis, their identity as being non-religious, and that being quarantined over to, in their minds, church participation, then obviously a difficult...
But that's even tenuous too, right? Because they go to yoga on Sunday mornings,
exactly,
or right, or they go to a circling practice, and not to diminish these practices. I participated in them, and they can be profound. I'm not being dismissive. That's not what I'm trying to. What I'm trying to say is you can't. Well, I mean, you can, in a sense of falling into sort of nihilism and other, but you can't get away from religio. That's not a thing for human beings. I see a lot of people driven. Well, this is my point. They're often driven into this autodidactic marshaling of mythos and symbolism and an ecology of practices, and and again, I really don't want to step on people's toes here, but it's often, in terms of its cognitive functioning, a place where I can speak with some expertise. These individualized religions are very suboptimal in many, many ways. Not that the organized religions haven't been suboptimal in many, many ways. That's exactly the problem. Where, look, the individual ones are very clearly we're realizing they're suboptimal. We have a history that the organized ones, for reasons that you often, and I admire this about you, acknowledge are suboptimal. And then we now know that the secular alternatives can be very, very suboptimal. And that's where I see a lot of people at. Right, I see this weird mixture of that they have to make commitments, the ones we talked about, because the commitments are, and this is the Kierkegaardian point, but I give it a cognitive science spin. The commitments are unavoidable. Like you're in the finitary predicament. You have to commit your precious attention and cognitive resources and time and the machinery of your identity. You have no options on that. Right, so they have to make commitments, but they're also deeply traumatized about making commitments, because the four big contenders, organized religion and organized political systems, political ideologies, wow, those went really bad. And people are now getting a sense, and I may be making it worse because of my criticism, that the autodidactic, individualistic religion of, of Peter or John or Mary or Susan is also deeply suboptimal in many ways. And I think a lot of people, that's a dawning realization. We've had several many decades now of various kinds of self-help ways of trying to give us a religious formulation of how to access a religio, and we're now realizing, no, that's not working either. I'm trying I'm trying to avoid all three of those and see if I can both provoke and provide an alternative. And so that's the difficult place I see myself in.
Well, and I think it's helpful for, to recognize, and this is one of the things that I've been thinking of. I mean, this has, not only did this, your autodidactic, not only did this happen in terms of a formal rejection of Christianity, but this happened within Christianity as well.
Oh, yes.
And I'm about to get into a little trouble with this, but in some ways, and I often say that evangelicalism is not so much, it's not an institution, it's a marketplace. And what happened, and of course there are roots in the Protestant Reformation with this, yes. But what happened in America, and you can see, if you read enough history, you can watch the pages turn. And if you highlight, the part of the reason I keep going back to Chuck Colson is because, he, in that born again moment in the 1970s, he's raised Episcopalian, he's divorced, and so he marries a woman who is Roman Catholic, and that's, doesn't matter how I'm raised. And just something that in previous generations would have never happened, where a Protestant marrying a Catholic. These are cats and dogs. And so we see, so then in the church and as a Christian, throughout the end of the Cold War, you use evangelistic techniques to try to pump up your church, which is essentially reigniting dormant Christians, but all along the way, they've been teaching themselves things. And so then churches get into marketing and, we're perhaps at a point where churches, at least in some places, Canada, the East Coast, the West Coast of the United States, maybe not so much in the middle, but churches are so weak, are weak enough that, in a sense, their traditional postures of stonewalling, which they could afford to do, are no longer affordable. And they must come to the table and begin to relinquish some of what they could simply bully their way through. And I know, I couldn't, the truth is, I couldn't do this if I weren't pastoring a small, insignificant church.
No, I get that. And whatever powers that be are looking at Paul right now, leave him alone. He's doing good work. So there's that. I want to say that part of what Jordan Peterson did, and again, I don't know how much he did it deliberately and how much he was, symbolizing it and drawn into it. But I think what he did, he began to tip away from the new atheism, because the core, I don't know if Jordan would agree with me on this or not. Maybe he seemed to agree when we were at conferences together and I presented some of these ideas. But one of the things Jordan showed is what the new atheists weren't getting is religio is inevitable. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Now, and I think part of what part of Jordan's struggle about that and his coyness is precisely because I don't think he was clear, perhaps in his mind. Again, I'm hesitant here. I can say a little bit more than most people because I've interacted with Jordan. I've spoken at conferences with him. I don't think it was clear in his mind, this distinction that you and I are trying to work out. They're deeply related, but they're not identical, religio and religion. And I think there's at least an intuitive understanding how important religio is and how much the new atheists were not getting it. But he also doesn't want to make a lot of the commitments that we talked about, and he doesn't know how to make that work. That's sort of my take on what's going on with him in some ways.
Well, and I think right there you really, and not just for Jordan, but for masses of people, like the video I just put out today and the one that's going to come out later this week. You know, for me as a pastor, watching, so I pastor a church in which the children of the generation that for the most part remain the core of this church, they didn't go to a Christian Reformed church. Many of them don't go to any church at all. The grandchildren don't go to any church at all. And there's both, on one hand, if you would talk to these people, they might raise moral, propositional objections to the church. And that would be one factor. And I want to take those things seriously. The other factor is, well, what for? You know, exactly. Why would I go to this place and participate in my own religious tradition? It's essentially a meeting with the monarch. You know, you have burgundy colors, and if you look at Christian Reformed liturgy, it's very much it's a meeting with the monarch, and we meet with the monarch each week, and the monarch greets us, we greet the monarch, we present gifts to the monarch bestows the lesson to the people, we bring our requests before the monarch. I mean, this is all the history that this comes into. And for many people, they look at that and they say, you know, that doesn't do anything for me. But then when they're out of it, they're dislocated. And then this gets into, okay, in a secular frame, what are you missing? What is built in that we have to participate in, that we might not even recognize we need? I mean, that we're, as human beings, we're so limited in terms of what we know.
Well, again, and it's odd. I feel odd commenting on this because
please do. You're so generous, John. I'm from New Jersey. We like to provoke each other. It's a sport for us.
Well, what part of what I've tried to do, and that brings me back again to the thing about dialectic, is I don't have an answer. I'm presenting an answer that has been given in the past, which is, well, what for? And the what for is, well, for wisdom. And I think one of the reasons why Jonathan's Eastern Orthodoxy might be doing a little bit better is because there's a longer and deeper preservation of the connections to the Neoplatonic and dialectic projects of wisdom, cultivation, and self-transcendence. And I think, and I'm not trying to put any kind of wedge between you and Jonathan or anything like that. I like the way we three work. I like it a lot. I love it, and I want to care for it. But I think that one of the mistakes is that the church has lost touch with what Augustine clearly saw. He saw Christianity as belonging to and culminating in a wisdom tradition. He properly called it a philosophia multiple times. And his first experience was not of a Christian conversion. It was only because he had the Neoplatonic mystical experience that he was able. Now, his reaction to it was different, and he gave it a Christian slant, but even within his own testament, his own confessions, right? The two are deeply interwoven. And I think, well, for reasons I tried to articulate, and I think the Protestant Reformation did have something to do with this, is that the connection to the wisdom tradition has really fallen away in Christianity. But here's again where I want to meet the criticism with praise. I see what you're doing with the meetups as deeply analogous to what Plato was doing in the academy. The dialogue and the dialectic is to try to bring back Philia Sophia rather than Philia Nikeia, and give people a home where the cultivation of wisdom it, for its own sake, is taken seriously.
Very helpful. Because what's so funny about our meetup is sometimes we have our meetup and it's like, I don't even know that we all know what we're doing, but we know we like it and we know we find it meaningful.
Yeah, exactly. Because, right, we have so much, and here's where I can hear Heidegger and Guy Sandstock in my head. We have so much idle talk, right? And we talk a lot. And the problem with Twitter and a lot of the internet is there's so much talk, but there's very little dialogue, and there's even littler of dialectic, where dialogue is being used for the cultivation of wisdom. I see dialectic as the attempt to create a psychotechnology that transforms dialogue into a process for the cultivation of wisdom. And we have so little of that. And so I think, but what I see, and both within the church, I'll use your term, meaning comprehensively, right? And also outside the church, like I see a hunger for this. So, you know, when I'm going to be talking to him later, when I see Rafe Kelly and the work he's doing, you know, integrating parkour, and then talking about like the meaning crisis, and then having, you know, people sit around so they've gone out and they've interacted together. They've done all that procedural, perspectival, and participatory stuff. And then they get some sort of cog sci. He uses some of my stuff. And then they sit around a campfire, literally around a campfire, and they dialogue, not because they're passing time or even doing social status maneuvering. I mean, human beings always do that because we're primates, but above and beyond that, they're trying to get, can we bring this all together so that dialogos emerges, right? And then even more dialectic. We're starting to afford each other's cultivation of wisdom and meaning. I see that. I see it. I'm talking to so many people where the culture is hungry, and all of this is happening in many, many places now, many places. And you can see it even represented like on Rebel Wisdom. The whole discussion about collective intelligence is a response to this zeitgeist that is taking shape.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, we've gone for over an hour and a half.
Yeah. I should probably go. So I have another meeting. I got 3 interviews in a row. After I'm done talking to you, I'm talking to a new person, and I'm talking to Rafe later. So I should probably go too. But I want to just, first of all, again, take this opportunity to thank you for being such a fantastic interlocutor, and for having me on your channel again. And also, I hope that you're going with your wife on vacation.
Yeah, most of the kids, 4 of the 5 kids. So.
Oh wow, that's great. So I genuinely wish you the very best of your vacation, and that I hope you find it deeply restorative.
Well, thank you. And I hope you enjoy your winter break, and that you find it refreshing, and you find a whole bunch of a new crop of young, fresh faces in your classes, and that will be that's a huge thing.
It is.
What a wonderful thing.
It is. So, and it's nice because at the university, it's not quite like where you're teaching people like in one grade or something. Like I often get them in multiple courses in multiple years, so you get a deeper sense of deeper involvement.
Yeah,
so that's really good.
Well,
anyways, I should let you go because we could talk forever. And I'm looking forward so much to when we're at the Urban Abbey, because we can have a lot of much more open-ended discussions. I'm really looking forward to that a lot.
Oh yeah, so am I, and especially with Jonathan in the room, because I think that will add. I am so looking forward to that. I can't tell you how much.
Yeah, well, Jonathan, after we did our last talk, he said he and I to have another one again shortly. So hopefully that'll happen soon as well.
I hope that happens too, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing it.
Okay, take care, my friend, and very best to the season to you.
Thank you, John. Same here. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.